as we approach, thinking about it, it's next month. It's about almost exactly a month from now, but we're approaching the 20 years since Hurricane Katrina. And we are still in the shadow of the deadly Texas floods. We have climate crisis on our minds as we see the regime again making its attacks against the EPA, against those who are fighting climate crisis. And, I try to remind people often that when we talk about some of the people in the past 10 years, I would say, who have gotten the most time, prison time, I'm talking in my talk now, right? Prison time, with respect to activism. We're looking at the folks who were engaged in the fight against climate crisis, right? Who were environmental activists, environmental protesters. And, I think it's something for us to keep in mind as we think about what is happening with the climate, as we think about the necessary work we're going to have to do to push back, as we think about the necessary ways that we're going to have to support those folks who are going to have to do this work. Henna Hundal is a four-time delegate to the UN Climate Change Conference, the national coordinator of Climate Live USA, and a freelance writer covering the intersection of climate and health. So thrilled to have you with us, Henna. Greetings. Thank you for joining the show.
Thank you so much. Such a delight to be speaking with you. I really appreciate it.
So we see that this regime, which is just, if they're not going to be happy until we just look like Mad Max in the Thunderdome, that's another story. But this regime has drafted a repeal of the endangerment finding, the very legal backbone for regulating greenhouse gases. From your view, looking as a person who's engaged in, work around climate crisis, who's worked in environmental law, how dangerous is this move to repeal the endangerment finding? And what precedent would it set if the regime is successful?
Thank you so much for the question. I think it's really important to frame here that we're only a few months into President Trump's second term, and the damage that has been done to climate policy, climate action, and climate science, decades of established climate science, is truly just astounding and really frustrating and highly concerning in terms of our future commitments to this issue that is an existential threat. Regarding the endangerment finding, so just to frame a little bit here. So the Supreme Court in 2007 heard a case called Massachusetts versus EPA. That case found that greenhouse gases are air pollutants covered by the Clean Air Act. And essentially, the decision turned to the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency at that time to determine whether or not emissions of greenhouse gases endangered public health and safety, and whether or not new motor vehicles contributed to that air pollution that in turn endangered public health and safety. And so that was the genesis of this endangerment finding, which essentially is the legal muscle behind allowing the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. And in particular, what the agency wants to regulate are emissions from carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluoride. So those are the six, greenhouse gases that have been targeted and are really important to curb in order to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that, as we know, contribute to climate change. And so that is really the basis of climate action, essentially. I mean, we know we have to curb greenhouse gas emissions. Otherwise, how do we actually, do meaningful action on this front? And so that's what's really concerning, is that this is really targeting kind of the fundamental infrastructure of what we need to do to make real headway on this issue. And I think briefly, it's also important to mention that when we think globally, in 2015, so one decade ago, there was the famous Paris Agreement, which decided that we need to try to limit global to average temperature increase to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that was kind of chosen as a threshold by which we will probably avert the worst of the climate crisis if we stay under that amount. And as we get over that amount, that's when things start to really spiral out of control. And so, in order to do that, we need all countries coming together at the table, participating in real climate action, which is, in fact, curbing greenhouse gas emissions. So, I think hopefully that kind of gives a window into why this is such a concerning move, because it's not a matter of just kind of delaying what we need to do. This is really cutting away at the fundamental tools that we need to have, and raises a lot of concerns for how can we even, rebuild this movement in the aftermath of a lot of this infrastructure being cut.
I want to ask you about the dismantling of the EPA's Office of Research and Development. But before I do that, because you bring up this, international cooperation, and this regime has seemed to not want to do that when it comes to anything that is helpful, right? Whether it be, pulling out of the Human Rights Council or pulling out of UNICEF. And thinking about these accords, this was one of the, these accords that have to do with the environment was one of the talking points of the, the election conversation of the regime before it got installed, that they were going to end all of that. And so do we see that happening? Have we seen that happening already in terms of this international cooperation of the United States on the in the environmental space?
As we know, if we're going to actually make headway on climate action, we need all parties coming together at the table. We need international cooperation to actually, do the most around this issue. And unfortunately, in the first Trump term, we saw President Trump try to take the United States out of the UN climate conferences, essentially, out of the Paris Agreement. Did not want to participate in that. And he sort of reignited that in the second term as well. In fact, when he got into office in his second term, one of the first actions he took was trying to, again, take the US out of the Paris Agreement. So right away, already starting to erode these international partnerships that are so critical for fighting climate change. And, in addition to that, we've seen, US representatives have to not participate in multiple international meetings. So we really are seeing that erosion of partnerships on a global scale. And I think this also, comes at a time when the International Court of Justice just this week issued an advisory opinion on the matter of climate change. First time they've ever done that. And essentially what they said is that international law obliges the protection of the climate system and other parts of the environment from greenhouse gas emissions due to human-induced climate change. And so they really, affirmed the need for parties to these conventions, to these conferences, who signed these treaties to actually follow through on it. So I think on a global scale, it's really concerning to see that erosion of trust. When I participate in the UN climate change conferences, all of that really comes to bear if all the parties can come together and really trust each other to execute on the agreements that are reached. And I do wonder, how many times can, we sort of come in and pull out and come in and pull out before the whole system kind of collapses like dominoes. So, it's a very fragile thing to get countries all around the world with, different priorities to agree on measures around climate action. And so it's again, we're kind of in the second Trump term where he seems to be even more intent on destroying those international partnerships around climate action.
That seems to be the theme of this regime, even more intent on harm. We are speaking with Henna Hundal. She is a 4-time delegate to the UN climate change conferences. Want to speak more with you, Henna? Hold on just a little longer. We'll talk with you more on the other side of this brief conversation with folks about how you can make sure that more of this type of content can be here through KPFK, Pacifica, Los Angeles, as we move to hearing from our good friend, Mark Maxwell, about how you can contribute to this station.
You can make your pledge of support to KPFK right now by going to kpfk.org or by calling 818-985-5735. That number again is 818-985-KPFK. As one of the oldest listener-sponsored radio stations in the United States, second only to our sister station KPFA in Berkeley, KPFK has been at the forefront of providing independent, progressive, and diverse programming since 1959. KPFK is one of the 5 stations in the Pacifica Network, a national network of community radio stations that's been providing independent media to communities across the country for over 7 decades now, with KPFA kicking things off in 1949. At its core, Pacifica Radio is about giving a voice to the voiceless. It's about being a platform for the underserved, marginalized, and underrepresented communities that have traditionally been left out of mainstream media. It's about promoting alternative perspectives, empowering critical thinking, and providing a space for constructive debate and dialogue that's often conspicuously absent from other media outlets. KPFK is dedicated to serving the beautifully diverse communities of Southern California with news and information, music and art, culture and history, and to providing a forum to share community voices and stories. That's your voice. That's your story. Please join us in our mission to provide outlets for the creative skills and energies of the community, to engage in any activity that contributes to a lasting understanding between nations and between the individuals of all nations, races, creeds, and colors, and the public presentation of accurate, objective, comprehensive news on all matters vitally affecting the community. Listener sponsorship is the engine that makes this station run and the pursuit of this noble mission possible. Please become a member of KPFK or renew your membership now at kpfk.org. If you prefer to call in your support, the phone number to do this is 818-985-5735. Once more, that's 818-985-KPFK. We truly want to make the world a better place, and we know that you do too. Let's do it together. Thank you so much for pledging, and thank you for listening to KPFK, radio powered by the people.
Let's do it together, folks. Let's do it together. We have a goal today, this hour, of $1,000. I know we can do it. I know we can do more than that. Showing our love, pouring our love into KPFK. Pacifica Radio, Los Angeles. Again, pleased to be speaking with Henna Hundal, who is the National Climate Change, National Coordinator of Climate Live USA. So pleased to have you here. So pleased to be speaking with you. Want to talk a little bit more about some of the unfortunate dismantling that is, potentially happening here, looking at the potential dismantling of the Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Research and Development. Clearly, it's a major source of scientific guidance. These folks seem to be at war, not just with Mother Nature, but with science as well. What role does science traditionally play in shaping environmental law, environmental policy, and what happens when that foundation in terms of scientific research and development is removed?
Yeah, it's so critical to have this actual scientific data for everything from establishing air quality standards to toxic exposure limits. I mean, all of that is based on having credible data. So if you don't have the means to obtain that data, you really open the door widely to politicized policymaking that is not grounded in the actual science. And so that's what's also really concerning. You're seeing so many people lose their jobs who were doing really good science. And it makes you wonder, at what point in time, if or when, will these infrastructures be reformed? It's also really important to remember that when we're talking about an issue like climate change, we have international partners and we collate our data together. For example, when we're thinking about global average temperature increase and looking at trends over time, all of it is really important and based upon having, this sharing of data and information with our international partners. And so, we're sort of failing on that front in terms of being really good partners and allies in the climate action movement. And then we're also severely limiting our ability to predict disasters before they come and think about what the actual response plans will be based on the severity. So, we're really shooting ourselves in the foot here by not having this data to work with. And I think, unfortunately, right now, it's convenient to not have this data, because if you really had the climate science at hand, it would only suggest actually taking action in the ways that we previously have. And so it's sort of like, if you don't pursue the data collection, then you can kind of keep a blind eye and stick your head in the sand to what the solutions need to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, in terms of not collecting the data, making it seem as if, no data, no reality, in the face of these flash floods, in the face of these wildfires, in the face of polluted water, a weakened federal agency, a weakened infrastructure, right? That folks have really been taking a lot of time to build. I think about what has happened in the area of racial justice and how you have people that have worked for, 30 years, 40 years, in some case, 50 years or more, and have gotten certain movements, right? It's not reparations and liberation, but they've at least gotten certain movements, and how it seems that in such a short time, so much of that has been rolled back. When I think about it and listening to you talking about the potential for what could happen in this area of environmental justice, in the face of all that is going on, do we have any guarantees? What are the tools might we have to be able to push back on some of this, understanding how dire our situation is?
I think you bring up such a good point that it takes decades to establish these relationships, build these foundations, acquire these tools, and it can take seconds to dismantle them. And that is really the dilemma here when we think about what does it mean to actually rebuild in the aftermath of all of this. In terms of the tools that we have, we have seen some states really step up and use legal levers to try to make a difference. For example, in California, there's been an effort to ban the sale of new gas-powered cars by 2035. In June, President Trump signed a resolution to block that. And then we saw, in response, California's attorney general sue the Trump administration over that resolution, attempting to block it. I think what that signals to me, and what's really important here, is to show that there will be resolve on our side too, that this won't go down easily, that these efforts will be met with equal power and determination and resolve from our side. And to really signal that this is not an easy issue to score some political brownie points with. So often, climate action, climate policy is often relegated to the back burner, seen as one of those issues that you can, kick the can down the road and maybe for a lighter day, return to it. And I think really that resolve on our side, showing that we will fight back, we will challenge these resolutions. This will not be an easy win for you, is how we move forward. And we have so much reason to do that. We actually have so much to protect that we've already built. You mentioned environmental justice. There were EPA offices around that were targeted for dismantling as well, which is so harmful when we think about, for example, Cancer Alley, an 85-mile stretch of land where, rates of cancer diagnoses have skyrocketed in the wake of potential exposure to pollutants. We need dedicated personnel working towards these efforts, and we had that. And so I think that really illustrates that we had a lot of infrastructure we'd already built, and so that is all worth protecting, and so the fight is worth it.
The fight is absolutely worth it. How do folks follow your work? How do they get in contact with the organizations that you're associated with if they want to plug in and be part of that resolve, be part of that pushback against the effort to dismantle the work that so many have done?
Yeah, please do follow me on Twitter. You can find me at HENNAHUNDAL, my full name, at Henna Hundal. I tweet out all my writings and some of my, radio and television appearances where I break down these issues. You can keep up with my work there. Also, I really encourage everyone to check out www.climatelive.org, the organization that I'm so blessed to be a part of. It's a youth-led movement to educate young people around climate action. And I think, that's where it starts. That's where we really start with the fight. Educating young people, through music and active forms of engagement. So check out climatelive.org and follow me at Henna Hundal on Twitter.
Thank you again so very much. Wonderful to be with you. Have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Likewise.
That was Henna Hundal, who is a four-time delegate to the UN Climate Change Conferences and the national coordinator of Climate Live USA, as well as a freelance writer. Wonderful, wonderful to have her on.